I'm worried. Not in a performative way, not for clicks, but in the quiet way you worry when familiar patterns start lining up. The more I look at America and the world, the more I see signs that we're in the early chapters of a great transition. Power is not vanishing, it's moving. Assumptions that felt permanent are getting stress tested, and the story is bigger than any one election or one news cycle. This channel exists to document that shift. I want to record in real time how the United States is losing relative weight, how other centers of gravity, especially China, are gaining leverage, and how today's headlines echo the way past great powers drifted when confidence, capacity, and cohesion stopped moving in the same direction. I'm not here to predict collapse. I'm here to track the signals, connect the dots, and ask better questions. Let's start with what the Great Transition means. It's not the end of America. It's the end of one configuration. A world where U.S. dominance felt uncontested, economically, financially, technologically, militarily, and culturally. In a transition, the leader still leads in many ways, but advantages erode at the edges. Over time, those edges add up in trade routes, in standards and payment systems, in technology scale up, in diplomacy, and in the price the leader pays to project power. Why do I think this is happening now? 6 signals. First, relative economic weight is tilting. On headline GDP in dollars, the United States is still number one. That matters, especially for innovation, capital markets, and depth of services. But on purchasing power terms, China now produces a larger share of global output. Look under the hood. China's strength is industrial scale. Factories, ports, logistics, build speed. It now accounts for close to a third of global manufacturing output. That manufacturing base isn't just about cheap goods. It's about the ability to mass produce the future. Batteries, solar, EVs, components, shipbuilding, and the machinery that makes machinery. America's edge is extraordinary in chips design, software, biotech, AI research, and high-end manufacturing. The tension of the 2020s is that these profiles collide. Industrial scale versus frontier innovation. Second, trade and payments are fragmenting at the edges. The dollar is still the world's core. Most reserves, most invoices, most safe assets. But the edges are changing. The renminbi remains a small global payments currency, yet it's used more in regional trade and in bilateral deals designed to route around pressure points. Meanwhile, the dollar's share of global reserves is still dominant, but not eternal. It wiggles with market moves and policy choices. The practical effect is a world that is still mostly dollar, but with more workarounds, more redundancy, and a little less automatic deference to U.S. leverage. That shows up when sanctions, export controls, and tariffs push partners to invest in parallel plumbing so they're not hostage to a single switch. Third, security spending is repricing risk. Global military expenditure is at the highest level ever recorded in the modern data. The United States remains unmatched in global power projection, alliances, carriers, logistics, sustainment. China spends far less in dollars but is building capability where it matters most to it, close to home. That creates a geometry of risk that history knows well, a global incumbent and a regional challenger whose industrial base can concentrate effects rapidly. That's when miscalculation gets cheaper and signaling has to work harder. Fourth, fiscal headroom is tighter. The bill for the past decade just got more expensive. With higher rates and larger debt stocks, the U.S. now spends on the order of $900 billion a year just on interest. That's not a school or a bridge. It's a transfer to bondholders. Great powers can carry debt. What they can't carry indefinitely is the opportunity cost of not investing in the next foundations, ports, grids, semiconductors, basic science, and people. Strategy without resources is theater, and adversaries read balance sheets as fluently as they read speeches. Fifth, the world is rerouting around choke points. For a generation, we optimized global supply chains for the lowest cost. Now resilience matters. Production is spreading. China +1 to Vietnam and India, nearshoring to Mexico, friend-shoring of critical inputs, and Europe trying to localize parts of the green stack. China remains the top merchandise exporter. The U.S. remains the top importer and a services powerhouse. That structure gives both sides leverage, but it also incentivizes alternatives. Every tariff, quota, and export control teaches the world to build a new path. The more we nudge, the more the world learns to go around. Sixth, domestic legitimacy is fragile. This one isn't about economics or ships. It's about whether citizens still trust the referees. Trust in the federal government sits near historic lows. Confidence in national news is similarly weak. And yet, the data on violent crime has improved from the pandemic spike. Homicides are down across many cities this year. Two things can be true at once. The country feels brittle even as some indicators heal. Fragility is a force multiplier. When trust is thin, every close election, every court decision, every policy swing becomes a stress test. Nations don't just lose power abroad when they stumble. They lose patience at home. Now, how does China fit into this? It's not a straight lineup. China faces a property hangover, local government debt, slower demographics, and the hard transition from catch-up growth to productivity-driven growth. But transitions are about relative motion, not perfection. If China compounds good enough growth on top of world-scale manufacturing and keeps climbing the value chain in EVs, batteries, and clean tech, it gains structural leverage, even with capital controls and shallower markets. Meanwhile, we should expect China to hedge financially, buying fewer treasuries than before, exploring other assets, and expanding regional payment options, all while global investors still buy vast amounts of U.S. assets because of scale, law, and liquidity. That's the paradox of this moment. High demand for the system's core safe asset, but more experiments at the edges. Let's ground this in the present tense. The United Nations General Assembly convenes this week with the U.S. President back on the global stage, meeting counterparts and signaling priorities. At home, a fresh proclamation is tightening entry for certain H-1B workers, part of a broader push to reshape labor markets and migration. Whether you welcome or oppose those moves, they ripple through supply chains, universities, and tech hiring. In trade, new tariff rounds and threats of more are reshaping routes and partners. The lesson from earlier eras is simple. Late-cycle great powers reach for trade tools more often. Sometimes it buys time. Sometimes it accelerates the search for alternatives. If all of this sounds familiar, that's because history keeps notes. The Dutch leveraged finance and trade, then ceded primacy to a more industrial Britain. Britain later ceded to an industrial and financial United States, with a larger domestic market and fresh balance sheet. Each transition had its own trigger points. A war here, a crisis there. But under the surface, you could see the same drift. Rising interest burdens, political factions louder than institutions, challengers compounding capabilities faster than incumbents adjusted rules. So what should we expect in the great transition ahead? Expect more blocks and less uniform globalization. More bilateral deals, more standard-setting contests, more subsidies, more friendly supply lines. Expect parallel payment rails at the edges, the dollar at the core, but more local settlement outside it. Expect defense budgets to keep rising as countries insure against uncertainty. Expect the U.S. to keep leading in frontier tech and higher education, but to pay a premium for inconsistency if we swing hard between policy extremes. Expect China to keep pushing scale, steel, ships, autos, batteries, while searching for growth models that don't rely on housing booms. Expect middle powers, India, Indonesia, Mexico, the Gulf, and parts of Africa, to bargain harder, hedge more, and accept fewer lectures. None of that makes decline inevitable. Great powers have renewed before. Renewal looks boring compared to drama. It's budgets that add up, courts that hold, audits that mean something, alliances that outlast personalities, and investments that raise productivity more than they raise headlines. Renewal is also cultural. Arguing like neighbors, not enemies, enforcing red lines against political violence without exception, and remembering that compromise isn't weakness, it's maintenance. So why am I doing this series? Because I think we need a record, episode by episode, of how this transition unfolds and what it means for ordinary people. I'll translate today's events into the logic of past transitions. When tariffs move, we'll ask how prior hegemons used them and what happened next. When a payment statistic makes the rounds, we'll separate signal from spin. When crime headlines spike, we'll check the numbers before we panic. When interest costs climb, we'll talk about trade-offs like adults. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I am going to give you frames and facts you can use. If you disagree with me, good. Argue in good faith. If you agree, better. Pressure test the claims anyway. The goal isn't to win an online fight. The goal is to think clearly in noisy times. Let me end where I began. I'm worried. But worry is just energy until you point it at something. Point it at curiosity. Point it at competence. Point it at the habits that keep a big, loud, diverse country from breaking itself. Checking before sharing, caring more about process than personality, and remembering that we are still incredibly rich in advantages that matter: talent, law, capital, energy, and a culture that, at its best, rewards people who build. This is the great transition. We don't get to opt out of it, but we do get to decide how we show up inside it. If you want to track it with me, subscribe, leave a comment with what you're seeing in your city, and tell me what you think we should watch next. In episode 2, we'll set the historical baselines for how past powers peaked and what their first missed signals looked like, so we can spot them faster now. Calm, factual, useful. That's the standard here. Let's get to work.